So this video is another attempt at deconstructing commonplace ideologies, specifically ones that involve or entail the usage of the word rights. Now, rights aren't exclusive to the right wing or libertarians. I'm pretty sure pretty much everyone, at least everyone on YouTube, seems to care a whole lot about rights. There's liberals care about rights, egalitarians care about rights, everyone's about equal rights, it's rights this, rights that. So this is generally a huge general critique of rights, because my view is that rights don't really matter, not insofar as what we're doing is creating, not in a utopian moral framework, not in a whole moral framework that covers all possible situations and separates right from wrong all the time. A framework like that could never work with rights. Rights are, at best, a practical tool for making hasty judgments about what's right and wrong in a commonplace social situation, but outside of that realm, what's right and wrong has absolutely nothing to do with rights. The way I see it is there seems to be a whole lot of faith within rights, and I use that word specifically because it's very similar. It mirrors the mentality that some religious folk have when you talk about how morality cannot exist without a deity. If you strip away a deity, if you have secular thinking, then you can't have morality. Religious folk will sometimes make this fallacy that will be their line of thinking, and people will say, well, this is wrong. You can have secular ethics. Ethics don't depend on a god. As the question's like, once you get rid of a god, where does morality come from? Where does right and wrong come from? How do you judge right and wrong without a god? Of course, they're deluded in that they weren't really judging right and wrong because of God. They were judging right and wrong based on sort of internal instincts and stuff. God was just the excuse. And it's the same thing here. I feel like rights are essentially the same thing that God is. How do you have what's right and wrong if there's no rights? If people don't have rights, how do you judge right and wrong in a framework that says nothing about what rights people should or shouldn't have? How do you judge right and wrong without there ever being question of freedom or lack of freedom? It's the same exact thing. And just like in the first case, the same thing is that people don't actually use rights to judge what's right and wrong. They use, again, internal instincts to judge right and wrong. Rights are just an excuse, just like God is just an excuse. I'll get a bit into that later. But the downfall of the rights model, just as the downfall of the God model the downfall of the God model, I think, is that God isn't well defined. You can't define God in a way that makes logical sense, is consistent with scientific data we have about the universe. How do you define God? I don't want to get into that, but that's essentially what the line of reasoning that I'd use. If you're going to define God, what would you say? The creator of the universe? Then my question would be, well, what does it mean to create a universe? Creating a universe isn't well defined. Scientifically, it's not well defined. So then any type of ideology that you get from that doesn't make any sense. Same thing here. How do you define rights? Rights aren't well defined either. In fact, the more you try to define rights, the more you unravel how poorly defined they are. Again, the same thing with God. The parallels between the two scenarios are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. I hear like the Molyneux crowd saying stuff like, well, you're exercising self-ownership just by having an opinion, just by talking, just by saying something. You're exercising self-ownership. But I mean, they state that like it's true without proving it. That's just an axiom, like it's defined to be that way. Like, define ownership for me, please. Define it for me on paper. Okay? And don't look at the dictionary, hoping for the dictionary to be on your side in this debate. Ownership is an abstract concept. So, given that you didn't learn about ownership by by reading the dictionary, you should explain what it means in the way you learned it. And I guarantee you, no matter what definition you come up with, the definition will not be well defined. Because what's ownership defined as? Well, people will say, well, you own something when you have the right to do whatever you want with it. You have the right or the freedom to do whatever you want with it. And it's like, well, what does it mean to have the right to do whatever you want with it? That means there's no coercion. Well, what does coercion mean? Coercion means there's no aggression. What does aggression mean? And you go in circles over and over again. It's a semantic freaking black hole. It boils down to the question of freedom. What is freedom? And the reality is that freedom also is not well defined, and much like God, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in the same way that God doesn't exist. And we dismiss God and we dismiss that type of Christian thinking because it's not well defined, and it's predicated on this concept that isn't well defined and doesn't really make sense at the heart of it, because you're trying to define a creator of matter. Like, what does that mean? How does matter become created? What does it mean to be a conscious creator of matter? Again, it's the same thing, but what does it mean to be free? I did a whole video about determinism, so I'm going to just lay down the facts on you right here. Freedom doesn't exist. There's no freedom. There's only determinism. And then once you get down on a small scale, there's quantum randomness. There's no free will. There's no freedom. There is compatibilism, but the thing is, what the compatibilists do, I'm just lay down, be completely honest. What the compatibilists do, their notion of freedom is not a notion that is in the way of determinism. Basically, the debate works in such a way, most people think of it, it's just like there's determinism and then there's freedom, and these two concepts clash. What the compatibilists do, because you can't contradict determinism, because it's too fundamental, it's too fundamental, like a logical truism, that you can't redefine determinism. What they do, the compatibilists, is they redefine freedom so that it gets out of the way and allows for determinism to cover everything, and allows for determinism to be true all the time. So they redefine freedom to be this whole other concept in such a way that determinism is true all the time. And this new form of freedom really has nothing to do with the type of freedom that most people think of. It really has nothing to do with the type of freedom that the political thinkers will use, and the libertarians will use, and the people who think about rights and ownership and all that stuff will use. That it's not that same kind of freedom. The freedom these guys have is very like ethereal, vaporous concept that sort of kind of awkwardly refers to states of being where there is no external vice and there are only internal vices. That's essentially what the situation looks like. But I mean, I would really what I would recommend, honestly, is for people, at least within this sort of moral, political thinking, people who do this kind of thing, this thinking that I do, is to not think of freedom at all, is to just abandon it completely. Because if what you're looking for is the most basic elements that inhabit reality, and you're trying to construct morality out of that, then you need to forget about freedom entirely. It doesn't exist within this world, and all it does is it muddies up and makes the situation It skews moral thinking and gets us into crazy territory like anarcho-capitalism. That's what it does. So, I mean, okay, I guess I can elaborate a bit more about that. I mean, I'm not going to prove that freedom doesn't exist. You just take my word for it. But I mean, I guess this is confirmation that the free will determinism debate is sort of more important than I initially thought. I thought this was just an economic debate, but it's not, because I mean, I feel like at least the Molyneux camp of libertarians, they have to believe in free will. They have to believe in freedom. They can't possibly be determinists. Their whole ideology crumbles if they believe in free will. It's this thing where it allows one to partition reality into free action and non-free action. And when you can do that, you can make very hasty, very easy judgments about what's right and wrong. You know, an action that is not free is evidence of coercion, which means something is wrong. Action that is free means there's no coercion, means everything is right. That's all it is. It's a partition. It's a very useful tool to partition reality. The problem when I say that it doesn't exist, if you believe me, if I take this line away, if suddenly there's no obvious distinction between internal and external vices, then the entire framework crumbles. You can't possibly make a decision. You can't possibly judge right from wrong as easily as you could before. You have to think all of a sudden, well, what do I do now? You know, what do I do? It's like, where does morality come from? Which is why I said, why I made that comparison with religion, is because I feel like, you know, the people that entertain the notion of freedom not being a thing go through the same kind of thinking. It's like, okay, well, if freedom's not a thing, where the heck does morality come from, right? That's exactly the argument I had with, I forget his name, but it was the guy in, like, the determinism video that I did a few weeks ago. This was the exact argument I had with him. He's like, well, where does morality come from if you don't have freedom? It's like, you're using the same kind of thinking that the theists do. The issue isn't that morality becomes arbitrary, because morality is arbitrary all the time. The issue is that it's no longer as easy as right, wrong, and freedom is the dividing line. It's no longer that simple. And that could at least be part of the reason why people shy away from it, is it's the same. Abandoning freedom means abandoning a whole bunch of all these different kinds of thinking and structures, and libertarianism can't possibly be true without without free will. At least not the Molyneux brand. The Knapp brand of libertarianism can't be true. There could still be practical libertarianism, but the Knapp brand, the deontological brand of libertarianism can't possibly be true. The deontological brand of communism can't be true. None of these political ideologies work if you get rid of the notion of freedom. Actually, wait, communism might work, but I'm not sure about that one, though. But you'd also have to abandon a lot of, you know, everyday social things like equal rights. People talk, like in the feminist debate, they talk just like, oh, well, equal rights, such an important thing. But, you know, if rights aren't a thing, what does equal rights actually mean? What does freedom of opportunity or freedom of something, what does equality actually mean if rights aren't a thing? If rights aren't a thing, then equality also becomes kind of an unpleasant concept. Equality literally becomes, you know, a society where everyone is just a clone. That's what equality becomes. And that's not the ideal world for us to have. So, I mean, okay, I'm going to peruse the situation a bit more. So, the libertarians will talk about ownership, and, I mean, they'll say, like, well, you own a strip of land, and you're free to do whatever you want on that land. But it's like, well, what about the lack of definition is staggering here. There's so many unanswered questions. First of all, there's a real question as to where exactly the land ends and where it begins. There's a fine line that you're supposed to put a fence on, but it's like, I mean, this is important, right? Like, what if the fence, technically the line is like infinitesimally small, right? If the fence is on both sides of the line, what that suggests is that one side of the fence belongs to somebody else. And if one side of the fence belongs to somebody else, then they can cut down that side of the fence. You sort of imagine as this is the fence, right? They can cut down this part, and suddenly the fence loses structural integrity and falls down in general. You can have weird situations like that. There's no question as to who owns the land below the land or above. Like, if you own a strip of land, do you own everything infinitely above and below it? There's that question. There's a question of what you can, whether or not you own what you can see. And this is actually really important. If you build a house that has a really nice view, you don't own the view, but you do benefit from the view. So it's kind of, like, property rights aren't violated, but there's no, resources aren't allocated in a, resources weren't allocated through a transaction in this case, right? Like, there's no, the view itself is a resource. It's something people will pay money for. It literally elevates the value of the house, the property. If you could have a nice view of an ocean or a park or something, that elevates the value of the property, which means the fact that the view of the property has a value, that is a well-defined value, has a monetary value, and that people can, it factors into people's demand for that property. And someone benefits from that view, that is a resource that they control even though they don't technically own it, right? It's a resource that they benefit from even though they don't own it. That's the real trouble with libertarianism, is that you have all these resources, that the reason that its ownership isn't well defined is because you have resources that aren't owned. For some reason, these resources aren't owned, but they are used nonetheless. Sunlight. Nobody owns sunlight, but it is used. View of the ocean. That's a resource that's used, that's a resource that is, it's a resource that is put to work. It literally is put to work. This was one of the definitions I heard of a resource in one of the libertarian videos I once saw by Stefan Kinsella. He was saying, oh, well, a resource is something that you can put to work. Well, if a nice view of a ravine elevates the value of the property, then you're literally putting it to work. It's creating value just by being the way it is. So you are technically putting it to work just by building a house there, but you don't own the view somehow. So, there's situations like that aren't, that are kind of messy, that don't have a good explanation. There's things like common property, like, places where people are supposed to gather together, and like, if the idea is that there's no such thing as common property, then, I mean, I don't really know how that would work, and I don't know enough about the libertarian free market theory about how that would work, but just by looking at it, it's painfully clear that anything that operates the same way that public property does now would be public property then as well. And you would have an organization that owns this public property, which would, in essence, be the same thing as a government. Only everyone would have to pay this organization to maintain the roads or the public property, which is the same thing as taxation. So, I mean, you get the idea. There's that whole fucking problem. Ownership, it's a mess. There's no way to clearly define it. Oh, here's another good resource that isn't affected. Emotional well-being. Here's how I define resource. Then probably should start with this. Resource. A resource is, because this is what it boils down to, the definition of resource. A resource is anything that a human being cares enough about to do something with, or to change, or to use. Anything that a human being values, anything that a human being wants to use. So there are clearly things that are valued just in and of themselves, like views of the ocean, like views of a ravine, nice views, like the emotional well-being of certain individuals. For instance, I have a child and I want that child to be happy. That means that that child's happiness is a resource for me by this definition. That child's happiness is a resource. I want to elevate that his happiness, So I want more of his happiness for him, right? But what that gives me is emotional well-being. So that, in that sense, emotional well-being is itself a resource. And if you think of that as a resource as well, then that makes everything even more complicated, right? Because now you have to deal with things like emotional well-being. And when someone violates somebody else's emotional well-being, are they violating a resource? If they are, then, and libertarianism, like the self-ownership, non-aggression thing applies to that, then then you would get you wouldn't get a free market is what you'd get. You'd get a society that's very similar to what I advocate for. But you literally would have to think of resources in this very general sort of scope, right? It can't just be goods, because services are also a resource. So it can't just be goods and services. And there are things that literally elevate the value of goods and services just by being there. Like I said, the nice view of the ocean, that elevates the value of a property. So I mean, that must be a resource. Also, here's another example. For instance, let's say that a trinket has sentimental value. That means that sentimental value is also a resource because it adds value to a trinket. That means that, let's say this is a trinket that my father gave me, and I have a lot of value for it because it represents my relationship with my father. Losing that trinket isn't just represented by the monetary loss of whatever it would cost to replace such a trinket from someone who doesn't have an emotional attachment to it. It also costs me emotional pain because it represents an emotional connection I have with my dad. That is an example of a resource, and it's exchanged, and it works exactly like a resource as well. It's exchanged and lost and traded the same way everything else is. Right, but I mean, you don't think about it. I have never seen anybody really think about it like that. But if they did, there would be, you'd have to rethink the whole framework because it would end up being something totally different. Anyway, so resources are the main issue. Is the question of when you own a resource. That is what's not well defined. So seriously, define ownership without using the words freedom, coercion, aggression, or rights, because all of that is circular. And the reason it's all circular is because it all boils down to this one thing: freedom, free will. People think that they have. If this thing goes away, all of these terms that aren't well defined also go away, and the entire framework crumbles, which is what I'm saying. But the important thing is that you don't need free will to have a moral framework. You might have a moral framework that people would disagree with, but you could still have a moral framework without free will. I've heard libertarians try and define their moral framework by starting off by defining what resources are. And just by doing that, they run into the same fallacy that I just pointed out, that they talk about resources, but they obviously think of goods and services. They don't think of emotional resources or things that are harder to calculate, like the view that you'd get in a property, or something that adds value to a good for certain people and perhaps not others. Or something that adds value to a good without necessarily being owned. See, the fact that they need to have everything under this ownership classification means that they need to, for them, ownership is important, and the only reason it makes sense is because they need to have this dividing line between free will and not free will, and if you get rid of that line, you literally look at all resources, which includes emotional resources and the the view thing and all that stuff. So all resources. In other words, what I'm saying is that their philosophy doesn't actually cover all resources or all exchanges of resources. For instance, if I do a bad thing, if I kill your family member, that causes emotional damage to you. So technically, what happens? Not only did I human life is another resource, by the way. Not only did I this was an exchange of resources. Everything in life can be looked at as an exchange of resources. So there's two exchanges that happened. The first exchange was that I took a man's life, which means I took the exchange was I get his life and, well, he gets nothing because he's dead, but I get his life. The second exchange was that I gave you, it's the second exchange is that I took emotional well-being away from you, because you are now distressed that your family member is dead. Your state of mind is worse than what it was before. So I took something from you as well. You know, it can literally be thought of as your property. I took emotional well-being away from you. I didn't do anything with it because I can't do anything with it, but I still took it from you, so it's still an exchange. You know, just because I didn't do anything with the resource, or even if I wasn't aware of the transaction, it still took place. And that's kind of the funny thing, is that you can have transactions that people aren't even aware of because of how emotional resources work. So I mean, in a situation like that isn't bad just because I took a man's life. It's doubly bad because I also took something from a person who cared about that individual. If I gave something to this man, if I didn't take his life, if I gave him $1 million and made him happy or something, then that I don't just create happiness for him, I also create happiness for you, his loved one. You are happier that he is happy. So what I did was I gave you emotional well-being. I gave you more. I gave you more happiness or took away. I gave you more happiness and gave you less misery, right? Or in the other case, I gave you misery. So misery and happiness are a resource just like everything else. That's why, you know, you have Sam Harris who says, and his moral framework is really simple. It's just imagine all of reality, all moral decisions, as creating some level of misery or happiness in the world. And then you have this sort of infinite n-dimensional plane where the peaks of the plane represent maxima, local maxima, where happiness is maximized, and the troughs represent local minima, where happiness is minimized or misery is maximized. And he's saying that morality is just, we want to get to the peaks and get away from the troughs, and that's all it is. And that's really simple, and that's an example of a moral framework that has nothing to do with rights whatsoever. Right? You don't need rights at all to define that. That is literally, that thing works just because happiness and misery are well defined. They're well defined because of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because what a person needs to make them happy is very easily well defined. It's not ethereal, or it's not even really that subjective either. I mean, it's a little subjective, but it's pretty clear. They need food, shelter, sexual intimacy, etc. So we want to maximize happiness, minimize misery. My point is, that is a moral framework that you can have without needing rights whatsoever. You know, rights don't exist. Like, you can write an entire book about that moral framework without ever using the word rights, ownership, freedom, aggression, coercion. You can write a whole book. You can live your whole life without ever hearing these words, but still being a good person and living under that framework. Right? I mean, you don't just... The logic there isn't... The logic there, it's like, you know, if you don't have rights, or there's nothing stopping you from killing or stealing. But no, that's the same logic that a theist will use to say, well, without God, there's nothing stopping you from stealing or killing. But there is. What's stopping you is empathy. Is you don't want to kill someone because you have empathy for them. You don't want them to feel pain. You don't want to steal from someone because you don't want them to be upset by having something stolen from them. You don't do it because there's a right that they have to their property. You don't do it because there's a right that they have to live. You do it because you don't want them to feel sad. That's it. That's the only reason. But, I mean, just note that both ways, you don't violate the nap. Both ways you get people who don't kill and don't steal. Both ways you get people who do good things, right? The reason the non-rights way is better is because rights aren't well defined. And the issue with them is that you get into crazy territory like anarcho-capitalism if you try and use them. Right? Because of that thing I mentioned before, the internal versus external vices. I mean, that's how I heard people try and explain freedom before. It's like, well, you know, a person is free if there are no external vices. Which, first of all, isn't even possible because there's always a circumstance which is an external vice by definition. But internal vices are themselves external vices, right? Like, internal vices are, you know, for instance, there's a guy that doesn't want to get a job because he's lazy. Well, that's an internal vice, right? And you shouldn't care. He's free, whatever. But he's not. The internal vice is a vice that exists because of a few things. Because of his upbringing, nurture, because of his genetics, nature. It's predetermined, right? There's no freedom here. It was predetermined that he would be this lazy individual. He couldn't have prevented this. That's the point. There's nothing he could have done. This was who he was from the beginning, or this is who he was going to end up being from the beginning, right? Like, his internal vices are his laziness, is whatever caused by his upbringing, his genetics. Well, these aren't things that are his own. His genetics are things that are passed down generation from generation. The way the chromosomes coupled up or whatever. His upbringing isn't something he controlled either. What parents he had aren't things that he controlled. Nothing. He didn't have control over anything. I mean, there's no such thing as an internal vice that wasn't at one point an external vice. In other words, everything is at its heart an external vice, which means, again, there's no freedom. There is no individuality. There is no individual that is separate from the rest of the universe. That there is no such thing as this is me, this is everything else. These two things are intimately unified. There's no dividing clear-cut line. It's like, this is internal, this is external. You can't do that. There's no internal external. The internal is itself, it responds and depends on the external. In other words, it is both a part of the environment. Like, individuality is an illusion, is what I'm saying. Anything that seems internal is in fact a part of the environment as well. You know, free will and consciousness, these are all just tricks that electrons in our brain play on us. Individuality is an illusion. You know, self-awareness is an illusion. It's all just programming, you know, made by neurons. It's just, there's no free will. That's the point. I mean, I guess I didn't realize how core of a concept this was, but it really is. You know, this is a core concept. Accept this concept and you will just see how inadequate the rights philosophy is. And how you can't, how you create a mess, you create misery if you try and divide things by this clear-cut line of internal versus external. So my point is that you can't ever really divide these two. At best, internal and external they're not well defined. They're approximations or guesses as to what's really happening, but at the end of the day, the full reality of it is that everything internal everything is both simultaneously internal and external at the same time. There's no line. There's no partition. This is all just fantasy. It's just like God. It's just like theism. It's just like, you can't have morality without this line. Well, you can't have morality without God either. It's the same logic. You know, what is absolutely true is you can't have morality without well, actually no, that's not true. You can't have morality without a consciousness. That might be true. But you can certainly have a morality without rights, and you can certainly have a morality without God. It's the same. Again, you just need to do some more work. And like I said, you can just look at resources and try and build a framework from that. And when I said earlier, when I said that God and rights are an excuse, what I meant was what these people actually do is every moral judgment that people make is their emotional response to an allocation of resources that they deem unfavorable. So if I kill you, and if I kill Jack over there, and Bob here is a bystander, Bob thinks it's wrong. The reason Bob thinks it's wrong is because what happens to the resources is Jack had a resource, which was his life, and I took that resource and threw it away. I took his resource from him, and I threw it away. I killed it. I destroyed it. It's a resource that can be destroyed, I guess. It is, yeah. That's one of the resources that can actually be destroyed. So resources aren't exactly like matter. They don't necessarily follow the same rules like you can't create or destroy matter. Well, you can destroy resources. You can destroy life. So Bob says, well, this is wrong. But he says it's wrong because God told me killing is wrong. But that's a lie, right? It's not wrong because God told him killing is wrong. It's wrong because he saw the allocation of resources as unfavorable. He saw what I did with Jack's life as an unfavorable allocation of resources, and he said this is a wrong allocation of resources. Bob could have also said, look, you violated his rights. You violated the non-aggression principle. You violated his rights of ownership. He owned his life. You took that from him. Again, it's the same, but that's also a lie. Because the truth is, that's an allocation of resources he thinks is unfavorable. It has nothing to do with rights, right? Rights are just an excuse. So, I mean, this is the same thing. And anytime someone mentions rights, it's always an excuse for something else. Unless they're using they're using rights, not rice. They're using rights as an approximation for what's happening and not for what's actually happening. If they're using rights as an approximation for what's right and wrong, that's okay, but see, if they're that kind of person that uses words like rights and freedom as approximations, then they're not a libertarian, and they're not an anarcho-capitalist, and they're not an extremist of any kind, because they understand that what's rights and free will and all this stuff, these things don't determine what's right and wrong all the time. These things are guesses and approximations at best. And that is the very thing that the compatibilists accept as well. Free will, freedom is an approximation of when an individual is not, when external vices are minimized or internal vices are maximized. It's an approximation of a certain kind of situation where an individual feels a certain way, and it's a situation where they feel free. If an individual feels free and they say that they're free, then you can say, well, yeah, that's freedom. But it's a feeling, it's not reality. The reality of it is they're not actually free because of determinism. But, so that's, I guess, that's the issues. You can't, like, actually, I never even thought about that. Freedom, yeah, is I guess freedom is a feeling then. It's when someone feels a certain way about their state of mind. They feel uncoerced. You know, the true reality of it is that they're always coerced, but they feel uncoerced. And if they feel uncoerced, you can say, well, it's okay so long as that they feel uncoerced. But the truth is, so if you define freedom like that, and I bet some compatibilists do, then you can't be a libertarian either, because there are cases and situations where people will say that they are being coerced, you know, by the system. You know, they're poor, they're being coerced by the system. The system is forcing them to pay, to get minimum wage and pay taxes or shitty jobs. The system is forcing them to do all this crap, and a libertarian might look at that and say, no, you're totally free. You're totally free. Well, I mean, I guess that's bullshit as well then, because there's no way that they're totally free if they don't feel free, right? Yeah. So that's, I guess that's what I have to say. So, in summary, freedom doesn't exist in reality. In other words, if we're using reality as the starting point, the first principles, the building blocks for our moral framework, we cannot possibly ever talk about freedom. We can talk about resources because resources are well defined. We can talk about matter, we can talk about energy, we can talk about resources, we could talk about consciousnesses, we could talk about all this stuff, we could talk about emotional resources. We cannot talk about freedom. Freedom does not exist in reality. We can talk about freedom if a person feels a certain way. If a person feels uncoerced, then we can talk about freedom. But what we must keep in mind is that any time that happens, that does not determine right and wrong. A person feeling free doesn't determine right and wrong. Just because they feel free doesn't mean that it's okay. It doesn't mean that it's bad. It doesn't mean that it's good. It could be horrible. They could feel free while they're, a person could say, well, I only feel free while I'm murdering children or something crazy, right? And it could be true. This person could literally feel coerced at all points unless they are doing that specific activity. Well, right there is an example of where, their freedom is clearly not something that you want. Or a person can feel free when they're, a person can feel free when they're harming others, or a person can feel free, or a person cannot feel free when they're being indirectly coerced by the system and by other people, indirectly coerced. And they cannot feel free in a situation like that. And in a situation like that, you might say that there's no freedom. Even though the libertarians might say that there is. My point is, you should forget about freedom as this objective measure of what's going on in reality. And if you just shouldn't use it like that. You shouldn't use freedom, ownership, rights, any of these things as objective measures for what's happening to people in reality. These things, at best, are feelings that people have about what they're doing. And certainly these feelings should be considered when judging the situation morally, but they are not the primary area of importance. We're not interested in who's free, we're interested in how resources are allocated, as I pointed out. As I pointed out that everyone actually does this. Even the people who say that morality comes from God are only really interested in how resources are allocated. And the people who are interested in rights are also interested in how resources are allocated. They don't actually care about freedom. They just say they are because they think that they are. It's an illusion. Again, Christ. It's an excuse for their own emotional reaction to what's happening. Their emotional reaction is someone died, that's wrong, that's a bad allocation of resources, but they say they use rights as an excuse. So the point to make about freedom is that it is not an indicator. It is not an accurate depiction of what's happening in reality, and it's certainly not an accurate depiction of the situation that one would need to have to make a good moral decision, to use the morality equation and make a good moral decision about what's right and wrong, to maximize human happiness and minimize human suffering. Knowing whether or not people are free is a tiny part of that. I mean, it's not even a tiny, it might even be a significant part of that, but it is not the whole thing. It is nowhere near the whole thing, and stop pretending that it is. That's what I have to say. Yeah, and I suppose that's everything. And then Mike Hugman told me that the libertarian philosophy is largely motivated by confirmation bias. Well, this is me trying to unravel that. If you have confirmation bias, what you can do is try and, like, what I think that is I'm trying to identify it, is I think it's the same thing that the theists do when they say morality, you can't have morality without God. That's the same kind of confirmation bias. It's people not being self-aware and not recognizing where morality actually comes from, and thinking that it comes from blah when it doesn't, and making up excuses. That's where it all comes from. The brain is very good at coming up with pseudo-logical excuses for its own feelings, and this is what rights are. This is what freedoms and rights are. And as cynical as that sounds, it's actually quite liberating. Ironically, it's liberating. It's philosophically liberating to see it this way. Rights are a pseudo-logical justification for the emotional feeling that comes from the brain, which is a reaction to allocations, to inadequate or bad allocations of resources that the brain reacts to. And once you understand that it's all just about allocation of resources in the brain, then this whole thing goes away. Then you stop being a rights activist or libertarian or whatever. I wouldn't call myself any kind of rights activist, except unless I'm referring to rights in that approximative sense that I meant before. I'm for rights so long as people feel, sort of good and sort of free, and that they have rights, and that's fine. But key situations. There are key situations where I think people's rights should be stripped, and taxation is spot number one. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Sorry for meandering at the end, and hopefully you get my point. Comment, etc. Cheers.